Hello, and welcome to the recorded content for the Early Adopters track in the Water Loss Technical Assistance Program hosted by the Cal Nevada section of AWWA. My name is Kate Gasner, and I am going to be walking us through the first segment of this Early Adopters track review, where I'll be talking about the foundations of the water auditing methodology and reminding us of some important things to keep in mind as we both compile the audit and think about the data sources of the audit. Here's our quick agenda. I'm going to go over some of the foundations of auditing and what we want to keep in mind while compiling an audit. I'm going to then go over the data sources, where we go to determine volumes for the audit. And lastly, I'm going to touch base on some specific tips and tricks when developing and calculating the specific inputs for the audit software. For those of you who are tuning in, this again is for and meant for early adopters, meaning that you've got some experience under your belt when it comes to water auditing and filling out the water audit software. If at any point this feels too speedy or advanced, we've got new learners content also available online, so seek that out and be sure to be in touch with us about which track feels most appropriate for you. Most generally speaking, I just wanted to address some important characteristics of a good water auditing approach. First, we want to acknowledge that this process requires a lot of herding data cats, as we sometimes call it. It requires a lot of coordination, a lot of data requests, a lot of calculations, and organization of data into one form, let alone the submission of that form and the follow-up of making sure the form gets to the right place. So it's important for us to acknowledge that the responsibility of completing the water audit is often best held in one person, maybe a couple people, such that they can keep track of where the data is coming from, they can take good notes, and they can get it in the right people's hands. The second thing we want to keep in mind is that a water audit is only as good as it is accurate and honest. So when we're selecting data, when we are discussing our data validity scores, transparency is going to be really key, especially when we turn to these audits for useful navigation of decision making and management of our losses. Third, we want to make sure that we've got an optimistic and gung-ho attitude about the audit. We're going to use it as a tool to highlight where we can improve our data sources and highlight where we have opportunities for water loss savings recovery. Lastly, we want to develop a sense of skepticism, not of our system and the results of the audit, but a skepticism of the data itself. Is it telling us the right thing about the volumes exchanged throughout our system? Are meters accurate? Can we trust that estimation? That kind of healthy skepticism is going to really help our understanding of confidence in the audit results and this question of audit validity. We also want to be practical, and that's where this pragmatism comes in. We want to acknowledge that it's not going to be economically possible or capacity possible, feasible to get a 10 on absolutely every data validity score. Some of those are going to be too hard to do or impractical for your utility, so we want to acknowledge the limitations of your utility's capacity in the context of getting a good data validity score or things of that nature. Lastly, we want to acknowledge that the water auditing process does take time. This is not something you can do on the last day right upon the deadline. You want to give yourself some solid time to both talk to your colleagues about where the data is coming from, talk to your colleagues about the results and whether that makes sense to you and the folks who know your system. Here are some of the basics of the M36 methodology distilled to 4 points that we're going to review today. The first is an encouragement to use the water balance as one of our best tools to understand water losses. The second is to acknowledge that not all water losses are the same. In fact, we want to distinguish and separate our total water loss into very different types of water loss, our leakage or real loss and our apparent loss volumes. We also want to identify and eventually understand the subcomponents of even those volumes, so we want to dig a little deeper into those different types of water loss. And lastly, we want to communicate our water loss results and findings in a couple of key and different ways. So first, we want to make sure and encourage everyone to use the water audit. It is standard best practice for assessing system-wide water losses, and it's a process of accounting for known volumes in your system such that you can estimate the lesser known volumes but still very real volumes of water loss. So here we are with the sort of concept of the water balance laid out for us. We know it's a process of elimination where we start with an assessment of all the volume that hits our distribution system, and then we go about allocating that volume to our known uses of authorized consumption. And our uses are what's left over or what doesn't fit into those authorized consumption volumes, and we determine as water losses. In this figure, we know that each column is an equivalent. So our system input volume to the left here is going to be equal to all of our authorized consumption and all of our water losses. And then we know that water losses in and of itself is equal to the sum total of apparent losses and our leakage. So with those equivalents, what we can do is start with system input volume or water supplied into our system and subtract all of our known authorized uses of water or authorized consumption. And then we're left with an estimation of water losses that we can then further categorize and grapple with. Another important point here is because it's a process of elimination, we're working with a top-down water audit. We start with a whole volume and we then disaggregate it into its component parts. Because it's that process of deduction, any inaccuracy in our first volumes carries over into our results. So any error that we introduce through an under-registering meter or a mishandled database or all sorts of reasons, any error that we see in our first volumes are going to manifest in our understanding or estimation of water losses. And that's why we're so careful with these data sources and are going to be kind of pestering everyone about the importance of understanding where error exists and trying to reduce it as best as possible. Here's our reminder that water losses is composed of two very different types of volumes. We've got apparent losses. Those are the losses that occur at the point of water transfer to a customer. In fact, no physical water is lost in an apparent loss. The water is used by a customer. It's just not paid for. The loss is a financial loss. So we deliver water, but we lose track of it, and we don't account for it appropriately such that we don't generate money for that delivery. That's an apparent loss. It's often referred to as a paper loss because it's an issue of accounting and revenue. It's not an issue of physical water that's lost. Whereas real losses are physical leakage volumes. Those are all volumes that are lost to the surroundings of our system due to infrastructure failure, whether a small service connection, line leak, or a huge main blowout. They all count as real losses, a physical volume of leakage. Those two categories we can further qualify and categorize. So for apparent losses, we know that those volumes of losing track of the water that we deliver can be split up into a variety of different forms. Some of the biggest volumes of apparent loss are due to customer meter inaccuracies, We know that all of our meters aren't perfect. In fact, very few of them will read perfectly. So we want to account for all of the water that they under-register or miss in their tracking of customer use. We also know that some customers just totally circumvent our efforts to track the water that they use, so we want to acknowledge that a certain amount of theft happens. Again, that's water used by a customer. It's reached its destination, but we haven't got a proper record of it, and so we can't get paid for it. And lastly, there are instances of data handling errors. These are the systematic data handling errors in that they are found in our processing and our handling of billing data. There's a lot that happens between a meter read and a bill that's generated, and sometimes there are consistent errors that are introduced that manipulate the volume such that we're not paid for a certain amount of volume delivered. We want to acknowledge that that happens in our processing and allocate a bit of volume there. On the other side, on the real losses side, we know that leakage comes in a variety of different forms, and we like to categorize it, especially when it comes time to planning around leakage management and intervening. This is not addressed. The asterisk there is to acknowledge that real losses are not broken down in the audit software, whereas apparent losses, we do have an opportunity to categorize these different types of apparent losses. The water audit stops with a total volume of real loss. So in our wave 3, when we connect in person next, we'll be talking about how to do what's called a component analysis of real loss, and that's where we really engage with these different types of real losses. In quick summary, we've got a few different categories we like to talk about because they describe how you as a utility have interacted with the leakage in the past. Some leakage is reported in that you've already responded to it, you've contained it, you've repaired it to some extent. Some leakage is background leakage in that even if you did leak detection or proactively surveyed your system, you couldn't find it because it's not making enough noise. It's the really small stuff. So we have to acknowledge that some of that is not recoverable using acoustic technology. And then there's this third category, unreported leakage, the stuff that is not going to surface. So unless you have a proactive plan, a proactive survey, it won't come and find you. It won't generate a work order. You won't repair it until you're a bit more proactive about finding it. Those are types of leakage that, as you might guess, in quantifying them, you get a much better idea of your leakage profile. And then you're informed to start making strategies around how to reduce losses. That's a quick preview of what's coming up next in some of our later sessions, but will empower us to think about intervention strategies a lot more carefully. Back to the water audit and what it enables us to do, it gives us very clear and consistent ways to talk about our water losses. First, we're going to talk about our water losses, both our apparent losses and our real losses in absolute volumes. That's useful in that we want to understand how much water as a resource we're losing to leakage and how much water financially we're not getting paid for in apparent loss. That's important to talk about in just pure volumetric terms. But it becomes especially powerful when we translate those volumes into costs, into financial terms. That's when we get to an understanding of what might be worthwhile to avoid those costs, what kind of interventions compare with the costs of those losses. And lastly, we want to acknowledge that the audit is not going to be perfect. In fact, the data sources that we put into the audit will inevitably have some uncertainty associated with them. And the data validity scores and our assessment of that data quality is going to be key to acknowledge right alongside the results of our volumes and our values. So when we talk about validity, the focus of our validation effort, in fact, is to talk about validity and how good our data is. We're going to emphasize the importance of talking about that validity, how we can acknowledge error and acknowledge how that impacts our results such that we are careful and confident about our results before we pursue intervention or take action. Now that we've gone over some of the basics of water audits and some of the tenets of the M36 methodology, I'm going to talk a bit more in detail about our data sources and how we want to think about the best ways to determine the volumes we use for inputting into the water audit software. Water supplied is the first volume that we'll address a bit more specifically for the water audit. This is a particularly important volume when we're completing the water audit. It serves as the foundation of the whole process. So as you can see here in our water balance graphic, our concept of the water balance, water supplied serves as our foundation, as our 100%. Once we determine water supplied, or the volume that enters our distribution system that is meant to serve our customers, we then go about allocating that volume to specific authorized consumption uses. And whatever isn't determined to be part of that authorized consumption is categorized as water loss. So all of which is to say, getting water supplied right is really critical to determining and estimating our water losses. It serves as our starting point, and so we want to pay special attention to it. Here we have an example of what your system may look like. It's got a collection of volume from your own sources, the sources that you own and operate. It's also got an input that's purchased from a neighboring agency or a wholesaler. And the collection of all of those volumes eventually hits your distribution system for the purposes of serving your customers. When we're asked to determine the total volume of water supplied to your system, we want to consider all of these different sources. So both the volumes that you own and operate in addition to the water that you purchase. And you're going to go to a variety of different sources to determine that volume. You'll likely see bills from your wholesalers. You'll hopefully have tracking. If you'll have meters on your wells, you'll have meters at your finished water from your treatment plant. You're going to examine all of these different documentations of water that enters your system. When calculating that total volume of water that does enter your system, here are a few double checks that you'll want to ask yourself. And of course, this is in an effort to get as accurate of a volume as possible. How much water entered your system over the course of the year that we're examining, the audit period? To make sure we have an accurate assessment of that total volume, we're going to ask ourselves, is this volume complete? Does it capture all of the volumes that entered my system? Did I make sure that there's no double counting? Sometimes we have meters that are in series and are double counting different sources of water. We want to avoid that. We also want to make sure that we're accounting for exports of water. There's another cell in the audit software that asks you for exports of water. Because that volume doesn't serve your own customers, and we want to focus on the distribution system and the volumes exchanged for your customers, we want to exclude exports up front. We want to make sure that we're only talking about treated potable water. So any volume tracking that's associated with raw water or recycled water, that is not included in this assessment of water supplied. There's also a very finicky volume that we have to appropriately allocate in our storage. So from the first of your audit period to the last day of the audit period, was there any significant change in storage such that you've introduced more water to your system than just these meters tracking of water supplied? In that case, you would have from the first day to the last, you would have less volume in storage. That would indicate that you've introduced more volume into your distribution system. Those are some of the more finicky elements to understanding this total water supplied volume. Of course, a really important element in understanding our water supplied volume is an understanding of the accuracy of our instruments that track that volume. In the water audit software, there's a cell, there's an input that allows you to correct for some of those inaccuracies. If you know the inaccuracy of some of your master meters that track this volume, it's important to take full advantage of that cell, of that master meter error adjustment input. Generally speaking, whether you know the specific error of a meter or not, we want to encourage you to evaluate the data quality from these meters to get your eyes on the meters and understand whether it's set up to read well. There are a couple different ways that you can actually test a meter's accuracy. The first way is to do a thorough volumetric test where you're passing a known volume through the body of the meter. You're seeing whether if you pass a full tank's worth of volume through the meter, it does indeed register all of the volume you know has passed through it. The other way to do that is to do a comparative meter test, such that you're introducing a trustworthy meter into the picture and comparing what that meter reads to the meter that is in place. It's an important distinction that when we ask about meter testing, people often give us answers that suggest they've calibrated their meters, and that's a slightly different insight. With that, you're getting important information about how your secondary electronics are functioning, how they're reading, or rather translating what the meter reads and converting it to an electronic signal to your SCADA system or however you export your data. That's really critical, and electronic calibration is an important element of meter maintenance and getting good data. But it doesn't necessarily give us an understanding of how the measuring mechanism is doing, and that's what we're trying to achieve with these volumetric meter tests and the comparative tests. Another one of our biggest volumes that we want to just review and remind you of some double checks that you should be doing when compiling your audit is the billed metered authorized consumption. This graphic is not to scale, so the billed metered authorized consumption is usually going to be the biggest portion of your total authorized consumption. This represents all of the uses that generate revenue and are metered, so are usually most of your customers. And here you can see in this representation our graphic of a lot of billing data, rows and rows and rows of records, each of which represent an exchange of volume from your distribution system to a customer. All of that data we have to investigate and then summarize with one volume, one number that describes all of your billed metered authorized consumption. And that is a big task to investigate all of your billing database and summarize it accurately. Here are a couple things that we want to keep in mind when doing that. We want to make sure that we're talking about the right records, that you're querying the right sub-components of the billing database. So we're excluding any non-potable records. If you serve raw water, recycled water, we are not including those customers. We're also excluding any record of water that doesn't generate revenue. Somewhat unintuitively, there can be records of water that is actually unbilled in the billing database. We want to be careful of that. We also want to make sure that we're doing our best to isolate the volumes used from our billing database. Sometimes our billing data will have records of what was paid for, but doesn't necessarily translate perfectly to what was used. If there are financial adjustments or back corrections and there's not a really consistent way of keeping track of how those financial adjustments relate to volumes, sometimes those things can confuse our understanding of how much volume left our distribution system for every record in our billing database. And lastly, we want to be careful about how we treat time in regards to billing data. We all know, especially for those who do bi-monthly billing or bill every other month, that every bill, whenever it's actually produced, usually represents multiple months of actual consumption. So a bill that's generated on January 3rd is probably going to represent or present consumption that happened in December, maybe even some consumption that happened in November. So when we summarize that record of 100 units was billed in January, we have to be careful because not all of that consumption happened in January. That's a long way of saying that we've got a billing lag time where our bill date doesn't represent when the consumption happened. And we're most interested in when the consumption happened. We're comparing inputs to outputs. So when those outputs occurred makes a difference to us. All of which is to say, we're going to be sensitive to how we select our audit period, what exports of billing data you focus on, and how sensitive your billing lag time is to a query of one particular year. All of that will ideally, all of those questions, all of those evaluations will ideally get us to a place where we are confident that from all of that billing data, we've landed with one summary value that appropriately represents the audit period's use of billed metered water, and we are confident it doesn't include any duplicates, it doesn't include any raw or non-potable water, and we're in a good place with that one rather important number. We'll move on to one more element of the water audit, another input that we need to supply the water audit, and that's cost data. This is going to be especially important when we're thinking about converting our volumes of water loss to costs of water loss. We want to make sure that that we're appropriately assigning our water loss the best value. And the water audit does that by asking us about a couple different costs. The first is just an assessment of total annual operating costs. This is going to come in to our performance indicators when we compare the cost of our water losses to the total annual operating cost. And to do this effectively, we want to account for all of the different costs of operating the system. So this goes beyond just your basic O&M costs. This is going to include your people costs, the salaries and benefits of your employees. It'll even include your debt service costs and any financing costs. It's definitely going to include insurance and administrative costs. It's the whole shebang. It's everything it takes to run the ship. If by chance you are in a public works department that operates a ton of different services, you do want to contain those to only the potable system. So careful that you don't go too overboard and include sewer system maintenance costs or parks and rec costs. Just focus on the potable distribution system costs. For variable production cost, another input asked of you in the audit, we want to keep in mind that this is our opportunity to value the total real loss volume. It very specifically asks you for the variable production cost, but zooming out a little, this is the number that we're going to use to translate the cost of our leakage. It's asking you, what does it cost us to supply the next unit of water? Usually for those who own and operate your own sources, the next unit of water costs you this what we call variable production, or simply power and chemicals. What does it take to increase supply in your treatment and transporting costs? For those of you who purchase water or only purchase water, you can also treat this cell as an imported water cost. What does it take you to buy another volume of water. Lastly, the last cost information that the water audit asks of us is a customer retail cost. Again, here zooming out, this is the value that we're going to use to assess the total cost of our apparent loss volume. So this is going to be an average cost of water for our customers. Remember, we're losing that water at the transfer of volume to the customer, so we want to make sure we're valuing that water loss at the customer cost. Usually we acknowledge that there are a variety of tiers and rate structures in every utility, so this needs to be one that represents a mix of those different fee schedules. A simple way of doing that is to simply take your total revenue sales from potable water and divide it by the total billed volume of your potable water system. That will capture all of the weighted averaging that you would otherwise do. And we also want to note that because we're determining a value of losses at the meter, any other volumetric charges should also be included. So if you do charge sewer or stormwater charges based off your meter, if that meter is under registering a bit, that under registration, that loss is going to impact those other revenues as well. So include those other volume-based charges in this customer retail cost. Once we've determined water supplied and authorized consumption, we know our total water loss volume. It's really important that as I mentioned for our discussion of water supplied, we're evaluating where our meters are that give us that data. We're asking hard questions about the maintenance protocols of those meters and whether they are giving us good data. Similar stream of thought for authorized consumption. We're being critical of our billing database and making sure that we're only looking at the appropriate records. We're not over counting or double counting. We're not excluding too many records. We're being particular and careful about how to get to that summary volume of authorized consumption. And once we do that, once we're confident in all of the water we input into our system and all of the water we supply to authorized uses, we are then left with, we can deduce our total volume of water loss. Of course, as you know, we're going to separate that into apparent losses once we estimate our customer meter inaccuracies and our volume of water loss to theft and our data handling errors. We are then left with a better understanding of specifically our apparent loss volume and our real loss volume. And we're going to be careful, as I mentioned earlier, to talk about these results in a consistent and effective and an accurate way. So some of the best ways to talk about water losses are featured here on this slide. We want to talk about our total volumes of real losses and apparent losses. And sometimes it's best to talk about those calibrated a bit for a system of your size. So we'll normalize total real losses per service connection per day, and the same for apparent losses. Those are two great ways to reference the volume of losses in your system. And then there's a performance indicator that acknowledges performance to a slightly more nuanced degree. It's the infrastructure leakage index, and it's particularly insightful because it acknowledges that there's a technical minimum of leakage for every system. The unavoidable annual real losses displayed in that inner box, that inner volume in darker blue here on the slide, that is modeled for a system of your system. That is modeled for your system given your system's mileage of main, the system's operating pressure, and the system's service density, service connection density. Given those parameters, the audit software calculates what we would expect to be the minimum amount of leakage for a system like yours. And that's critical because it acknowledges that even a highly managed, super monitored, aggressively managed system is going to be leaking a certain amount of water. And once we know that, then we can compare the current level of losses to that technical minimum baseline. And that's what the ILI does. It takes your actual volume of real losses, the volume of water losses determined by the water balance, and it compares it to that modeled technical minimum. So with an ILI of 2, for example, I know that my system is losing twice the amount of this modeled technical minimum for a system of my characteristics. That's going to be really useful to know and a very insightful way to think about where there's opportunity for improvement and what levels of losses we might expect for a very high performing system of your characteristics. What I'm going to do now is go over and remind folks of how error manifests in the water balance. I'm going to go through an example of looking over the data sources of water production, the data sources behind the input for our water supplied determination, and just show you by way of example how any error up front in our volumes is going to have a big impact in our results on the back end. So here we are. This is a pretty typical display of what you might see when you ask your colleagues over in production or water resources to give you a summary of a calendar year of your total system's production, all of the water that you supplied into your system. What we see here is that this very hypothetical utility has a surface water treatment plant that's operating throughout the year. We've got 3 wells that are operating on and off throughout the year, and we've got an import connection. We purchase water from a wholesaler. And if I were naive to this process, if I didn't know much about the audit, it would be my instinct just to sum across all of these columns and rows and say, there it is, that's the amount of water I supplied into my system. If I were to do that, I would take a look at this and I would quickly see that I supplied just over 2,000 million gallons into my system. But what I want to encourage you to do is take a much closer look both at this summary data, and then if we were to really go through this process, I'd encourage you to take a look at even the sources of data behind this summary table and investigate, are these sources of data complete? Are they consistent? Are they telling a story that we would expect given what we know about our operations? And are they accurate? Do we have any indication that the meters behind this data or the sources of this data are doing a good job and accurately tracking the volumes of production? When I do take a slightly closer look, I've highlighted some areas of concern. Our treatment plant seemed to, something went awry in May, so I have very little production from my treatment. In fact, no production. There's a blank in my May treatment plant record. I also see the same thing, a blank record of production in September for one of my wells. And my third well isn't online until April, or I'm missing data for 3 months of one of my wells. If I looked closely at the table, I could see those gaps, or if I graphed my monthly production, I could definitely see that something is a bit off when it comes to at least one of my months of total production. We're going to fast forward through a lot of the heavy lifting that happens behind the scenes and looking over what would be the raw data sources and in having conversations with your colleagues about where this data came from and what it tells us about what actually was produced into our system. But here are some guiding questions and some examples of some very real findings once you start looking at the details. I first want to understand is my production data in this case complete? Have I captured all of the instances of volume that enter my distribution system? And lo and behold, when I do look into it, we are indeed lacking treatment plant data for May. The SCADA system went down, some issue happened, so I need to recuperate some data for that big volume in May. And I don't have well data for September, so I have to go back to some manual reads and recover some of that. In my discussions with colleagues, though, I did find that that gap at the beginning of the year for well 1, that was because it was down for maintenance, so that gap was validated. It was confirmed to be a true lack of data because no volume was coming from that well. I next ask myself, is it consistent? Do I have any reason to be suspicious of the data as it's presented? And once I start looking at the daily values of production and some of the more raw data, I realize that there's a sprinkling of null values. It turns out our SCADA system is somewhat erratic, so I have to back correct for some lack of daily volumes, and that bumps up my total a little bit. There's also a lack of, there was a misplacement of a decimal, a magnitude error in one of my October readings, so I've got to go and correct that. That's something that you won't, these are examples of stuff that you won't see if you're just looking at summary data, or you just send an email to your production colleague and say, hey, what did we produce in calendar year 2015? This is the stuff that you'll only find and is your reward for doing the work of taking a much closer look. Lastly, I want to understand, is my data reliable? Is it actually accurate? And with some digging, I understand that no, in fact, one of my bigger import volumes, that purchased water volume, that meter has been known and is recently tested to be under registering by a significant amount. So I want to correct for that volume. And in fact, if you know of an inaccuracy issue, there's a space in the audit software for you to correct for master meter error adjustments. And lastly, I don't have any other proof or evidence of volumetric testing or calibration issues, so I cannot correct for any other accuracy issues. After I've done all of that, I'm going to now present how that change affects my water balance. Here you can see that I've changed my water supplied volume a fair amount. I've increased the volume, I've recovered volume, I've corrected for issues to find that the true volume of production for my system during this audit period was 206 million gallons above where my data suggested at the start. So my new, more reviewed, more thoroughly investigated number is going to be 2,230 million gallons. And you can see if my authorized consumption, let's pretend everything else in the audit was well done, first round, you can see that that really changes the results of my audit. In adding 200 million gallons for my assessment of water supplied, you're directly impacting your assessment of real losses. Remember, this is a process of deduction, so if I add more volume to my water supplied volume without changing any of my assessments of authorized consumption, then I'm going to be directly impacting and increasing my estimation of real loss. And what's especially notable is that even a 10% increase in my water supplied assessment, because it's that foundational volume, has a dramatic increase in my total real loss assessment. Here, as you can see, that 10% change manifested as a 300% change in my real loss metrics. That's because we're working with smaller volumes at the end of this process, so any change up front is going to have a big impact and a relatively major change in our smaller volumes of water loss. If you were a water utility that was facing this audit and the changes in this audit, I think we'd all agree that going from a real loss per connection per day value of 13, changing that to a real loss per connection per day value of 52, that's a sizable difference. And even further still, an ILI of 0.77, which suggests you're losing less than the technical minimum, and then changing to an iLive 3.2, which suggests you're losing 3 times the technical minimum, those are pretty significantly different pictures of water loss. And that was all because we made some changes and back corrected for some error in one of our first water audit inputs. Again, the importance of reviewing data sources critically can't be emphasized enough, and I hope this is an example that you'll keep in mind when thinking about the consequences of being careful with our input volumes. What I'd like to do now is quickly review the water audit software and remind folks of how to use the data grading matrix and why we score, or rather why we use our data validity scores. So the main tool that we use when we are creating a water audit is the AWWA water audit software. The most recent version is version 5.0, and it's freely available on the Water Loss Control Committee's site. That's the AWWA Water Loss Control Committee. And once you open the software, you'll see that it's got a wide variety of sheets on it. The sheets that require your attention and your data entry are going to be the first sheet that asks you of your basic information, who you are and which utility you represent, what audit period you're going to be focusing on. The second sheet that requires your entry is the reporting worksheet. That's going to ask for all these volumes, your input volumes and your authorized consumption volumes, some infrastructure figures, and some cost data. And then another sheet that is new to version 5.0 that requires your data entry is the comments sheet, where you get an opportunity to narrate how you went about determining those volumes and any other thoughts that are helpful to the process of documenting your work and qualifying your water audit results. There's a legend, a color-based legend to the different input cells. The white cells are values that require your entry, your data entry. The yellow cells are calculated for you. They're automatically calculated. The gray-purple cells are contain values that you can use as a default in the absence of your own data. So for values and volumes that are a little difficult to determine, things like volumes of theft for your system, or those sneaky data handling errors, that kind of thing, you'll have an option. If you don't have good data for your own system, which is often hard to get, you'll have the option of using a default. Here's a zoomed in portion of some of that reporting worksheet. This is the water supplied portion, where you're asked for the volume of your own sources, the water that you import, and the water that you export. As you'll see, there are a few different components of each of those volumes, and we'll go through those now. The first component is the volume itself. So to the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the highlighted cells. That's where you put the actual volume. And for each one of these inputs, you'll quickly learn that there's a bit of work to be done behind the scenes. So for every input, you'll probably have an Excel spreadsheet or a file that represents the raw data and shows the calculations of where that data came from and how it got to be that summary, that specific summary value. You'll also see these blue action buttons with question marks. Those are going to hyperlink you to the glossary where the specific definition for each of those inputs will be highlighted. If you have any questions about what counts or doesn't count, what should be included, or what the official definition of any of those volumes are, that's the button for you. Another super useful hyperlink is this plus action button, and that's going to hyperlink you to the box, the specific input box for comments that you can use to qualify how you determined that specific volume, where you got the data, what your concerns about the data are, and what maintenance or data source qualifications you'd like to make. The comments box is one of those things that we're really encouraging folks to use because it allows a great documentation for us as validators to quickly understand what's behind some of your scores and some of your numbers. And it produces a great documentation for the longevity of your auditing process. Whomever is the lucky person to take this on next will be eternally grateful for a good comment box use. Last but definitely not least, we've got the data validity score input. This is something that is one of the main focuses of our validation efforts, is an appreciation and a review of the scores that you've selected for each input. So what is a data validity score? Data validity scores are a number, 1 through 10, that aims to qualify the data source quality behind the volumetric input that you've added to the software. It's very specific in nature, but it generally describes how reliable the data source is in how best you adhere to best industry practices on data maintenance or meter maintenance, those kinds of things. For each data score, there are very specific criteria. Criteria like how much of this volume is metered, how often do you test those meters, what are the results of those tests, how often do you get the data source reviewed by a third party or audited. Those are the types of things that are going to contribute to a data validity score selection. And your job as someone completing the audit is to select the highest score where the utility meets or exceeds, where your utility meets or exceeds all of those criteria. So you have to ask yourself questions on whether you as a utility whether your protocol accomplishes all of those criteria. The data score is meant to eventually convey the confidence with which you can treat your numbers. So the higher data validity score, the more regard we can present that input. So the more we'll trust that input. It doesn't guarantee accuracy by any means, but the more you're doing in those best practices of data maintenance and meter testing and things of that nature, the more likely it is that data point is accurate. So it's really helpful to understand where there are data weaknesses in the audit, and overall it helps you understand the general quality of the audit and whether the results are meaningful and significant based on the data quality. The audit wraps up with a display of a consolidated sheet that displays your performance indicators. So once you've completed all of the input volumes and you've scored all of those input volumes with a data validity score, the audit summarizes the estimation of your water losses on a performance indicator tab. As you'll see, the performance indicators are categorized in these different buckets. The first is just a presentation of total volumes. You've got a total volume of apparent losses and a total volume of real losses. You've also got some normalized volumes presented towards the bottom there. The performance indicators also include a presentation of annual costs. So you've got an annual cost of apparent losses and an annual cost of real losses featured. And lastly, we have a display of that total data validity grade. It's not going to be a perfect sum across all of the individual scores you've assigned your inputs, but it is a weighted average that takes the significance and the volume of each input into account. And that validity is meant to communicate a general understanding of how accurate your audit could be. It doesn't guarantee accuracy, nor does it communicate bad data necessarily, but it does communicate adherence to best practices, and that can be a good indication of how much you should take stock of your data sources, how much regard we can put towards these results. Lastly, with that star down below is the ILI, one of our favorite performance indicators that compares your current annual real losses to that technical minimum of real losses, giving you a well-grounded understanding of where your performance is relative to that technical baseline. In the next segment offered in the early adopters track, Will Jernigan is going to speak in much greater detail around the validation methodology, what we're going to be looking out for in understanding and reviewing the appropriate use of the audit, the appropriate determination of volume inputs, and the best assignment of data validity score. He'll also review what you should be doing to prepare for our next point of connection in Wave 2 when we connect on conference call and take a look at your utility-specific data. Thank you for tuning in to this recorded content, and if you have any other questions, we're excited to announce that our website will be one of our best forms of communication going forward. www.californiawaterloss.org.com will also work. That is going to be a great repository of information and also a really good first place to go if you have any questions about where the program is, what we've done, and what's up next. That's going to be a great source of information. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. The best way to do that is through our email, waterlosscontrolcollaborative@gmail.com. Thanks again for tuning in, and we're looking forward to connecting with you specifically on your data come Wave 2. Thanks again.